The sound of tires screeching against asphalt cut through the quiet evening, sending a ripple of unease through the air. A police cruiser rolled to a stop in the middle of a neighborhood street, its red and blue lights flashing in harsh, relentless patterns. It wasn't the first time Officer Daniels had made a stop like this. He'd been on the force for nearly 15 years, and in his eyes, he could spot trouble a mile away. Or so he thought. "License and registration," he barked, his voice cold and clipped as he loomed over the driver's side window. The man sitting in the car was calm, almost unnervingly so. He wore a crisp black suit and a perfectly tied tie, the kind of outfit that screamed importance. But Daniels didn't care about appearances. To him, it was just another excuse, another suspicious-looking black man who didn't belong in this neighborhood. The man in the suit reached slowly for his wallet, his movements deliberate. He didn't seem scared, which only irritated Daniels more. There was no stammering, no nervous fumbling, just a quiet, measured response. "Of course, officer," he said, handing over the requested documents. His tone was polite but firm, as though he was used to encounters like this. Too used to them. Daniels scanned the license, his eyes narrowing. Something about the man's calm demeanor rubbed him the wrong way. It felt like a challenge. He leaned closer to the window. "What are you doing here? This isn't your kind of place," he sneered, ignoring the fact that the man's car, a sleek, black sedan, looked far more expensive than anything most of the locals could afford. "I'm here on business," the man replied evenly, locking eyes with Daniels. His voice carried an authority that made the officer hesitate for a fraction of a second, but pride wouldn't let him back down. Instead, Daniels smirked and stepped back. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, resting his hand on the butt of his holstered gun. "Now." A few neighbors peeked through their windows, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. They'd seen Daniels act like this before, but no one dared intervene. The man in the car sighed, clearly frustrated but still composed, as he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. He stood tall, his presence commanding in a way that was hard to ignore. "Hands on the hood?" Daniels snapped, motioning toward the car. He was itching to assert his authority, to make sure this man knew who was in charge. But as he patted the man down, searching for any excuse to escalate the situation, he froze. "What's this?" Daniels muttered, pulling out a leather badge holder from the man's inner jacket pocket. He flipped it open, his face draining of color as his eyes landed on the unmistakable emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I was trying to tell you," the man said quietly, his voice sharp now, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Hill, FBI, and you just made a very big mistake." Daniels blinked, his hand still clutching the badge, as the weight of his actions began to sink in. But before he could respond, a second police car pulled up, its siren cutting through the tense silence. The night had just begun, and things were about to take a turn no one could have predicted. This opening sets the stage for the drama and tension to come, with a strong focus on character dynamics and escalating conflict. The second police cruiser screeched to a halt behind Officer Daniels' car, the sound of the tires skidding on the wet pavement like a warning to the world. Two officers stepped out, both of them looking confused as they surveyed the scene. Officer Daniels stood frozen, the leather badge still in his hand, the glint of it reflecting the streetlights. The man in the suit, Agent Marcus Hill, stood perfectly still. His eyes focused on Daniels with an intensity that made the officer feel like a kid who'd just been caught stealing cookies from the jar. "Daniels," the new officer called, his voice sharp. "What's going on here?" Daniels didn't answer immediately. He was still processing what had just happened. Special Agent Marcus Hill? FBI? What the hell was this guy doing here, in the middle of a neighborhood that Daniels had patrolled for years? His mind raced. He'd seen plenty of shady characters pass through these streets, but none like this. None who looked so damn polished. It was the kind of thing that made Daniels uncomfortable, when things didn't add up, when the story didn't make sense. I think we've got a situation," Daniels muttered, still holding the badge in his hand, as if it might vanish at any moment. The new officers exchanged a quick glance, sensing the tension. "Is he?" the officer who just arrived began. But Daniels cut him off. "He's FBI," Daniels replied, his voice low and hesitant. "Special Agent Marcus Hill." The other officers froze, their eyes flicking to Hill, who remained unmoving. His calmness was unnerving. Most people, when faced with a confrontation like this, would be defensive or angry, but Hill just stood there, composed as if nothing had changed. "Is that so?" the officer asked, his voice skeptical. "And you just arrested him?" Daniels didn't know how to respond. The words didn't make sense in his head. How could he explain this? How could he admit that he just treated a federal agent like a common criminal because of his skin color? The truth felt suffocating. Hill's suit, the calm manner, the badge, all of it didn't fit into the narrative Daniels had in his head, the one where a black man in a nice car didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. He had thought he was doing his job, that he was protecting the area from someone who didn't fit in. But now, standing in front of Hill, it felt like a bad dream. And no matter how hard he tried to shake it off, Daniels couldn't wake up from it. Hill finally broke the silence, his voice cold, but laced with authority. "I wasn't under arrest, officer. I was being detained without cause. You didn't even ask me why I was here." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "You didn't exactly seem like someone who belonged here." The words slipped out before he could stop them. The new officers flinched, and Hill's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward. It was like the air itself grew heavier, the quiet tension settling into something thicker. "I was on my way to meet someone," Hill replied evenly, not raising his voice, but somehow making the words feel like a demand. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, officer. You just assumed, based on the way I look, that I didn't belong here." Daniel stiffened, and he couldn't stop the heat rising in his chest. Hill had hit the nail on the head. His gut had told him to pull over the car, but he hadn't stopped to think about the reasons behind it, because deep down, it had always been easier to see the man as a threat rather than a person. He didn't want to face that, didn't want to confront the ugly truth of his own biases. But now, it was right in front of him, staring him down with those piercing eyes. The officers from the second car exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They had been trained to follow Daniel's lead, but they weren't sure where this was headed. The situation was escalating quickly, and no one was sure how to stop it. "You're lucky I didn't run your name through the system already," Daniels muttered, his voice low but laced with bitterness. The words came out harsher than he intended, but there was something about Hill's composed demeanor that got under his skin. It was like he was being tested. No, like everyone was being tested. And the worst part was that Daniels wasn't sure if he was passing or failing. Hill's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "What? You think I'd let you get away with that? Running my name through the system without a reason?" His voice was still calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I am the system, officer. I am the reason." Daniels could feel his face flushing, his mind racing. He had never been in a situation like this, never had to confront someone with that kind of power. Hill wasn't just any person. He was a federal agent. He was everything Daniels wasn't, and that made him feel small. There was no one who could back him up, no one who would defend him if things went sideways. Hill wasn't just a guy in a suit. He was someone who could end Daniels' career with a single word. And he knew it. "You have no idea who you're messing with, do you?" Hill continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've already made your assumptions, and now you've made your move. But this isn't over, officer. Not by a long shot." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Daniels to step out of line, daring him to make the next move. The seconds stretched on, each one filled with the weight of what had just transpired. Daniels was still holding the badge in his hand, but now it felt more like a symbol of everything he had gotten wrong than a sign of authority. He could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, waiting for him to make the next decision. But how could he? What could he say to make this right? Was there any way to fix what he had already done? Before he could answer, another sound cut through the tension, the sound of a distant car alarm blaring, loud and sudden. The officers jumped, momentarily distracted, and Daniels used the brief distraction to glance away. But when he looked back, Hill was no longer just a man in a suit. He was a problem. One Daniels wasn't sure how to solve. And the worst part? Hill was waiting. He was waiting for Daniels to make the next move, to see if he would take responsibility or try to cover up the mess he'd just created. And that wait, The pressure of it was almost more than Daniels could bear. Just then, a new voice broke the silence. It wasn't one of the officers. It wasn't even Hill. It came from a figure approaching from the shadows, a figure that no one had noticed before. But now, everything was about to change. The figure stepping out of the shadows was tall, his presence instantly commanding. He moved with a quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the tense standoff that had consumed the street. The officers hadn't noticed him before, but now, with his sudden appearance, the air shifted again. He didn't wear a uniform. He wasn't an officer. But there was something about him, something dangerous about the way he carried himself, that made everyone pause. "Is there a problem here, Officer Daniels?" the man asked, his voice low, smooth, almost too calm for the situation. Daniels froze. The words felt like a jolt of cold electricity. He didn't know this guy, but somehow he felt like he should. He turned to look at Hill, but Hill wasn't even flinching. His face was impassive, unreadable, like this moment was just another part of his day. The man in the shadows, however, was another story. There was no mistaking it. He wasn't a cop, but the way he held himself, like he knew things others didn't, made Daniel's skin crawl. The newcomer took a slow step closer, his eyes flicking over each of the officers, sizing them up as though they were no more than pawns in a game he was playing. He didn't make eye contact with Daniels. Instead, his gaze landed squarely on Hill. "You were right to stop him," the man said, the words measured, calculated. "But you handled it poorly." His eyes moved back to Daniels, lingering for a moment before returning to Hill. "Then again, I wouldn't expect much from a man who lets his prejudices guide his decisions." Daniels bristled. His fists clenched at his sides, and his breath hitched in his chest. He wanted to lash out, to shout, to defend himself. But something about the way the man spoke, like he was watching, studying, kept him rooted in place. He could feel the tension between the officers, like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest wrong move. Hill, however, didn't seem affected. "I wasn't looking for your approval," he replied coolly, though his words didn't carry the same cold edge they had moments ago. There was something different in his voice now, something guarded. "But you can help make this right." The man chuckled, his lips curling into a half smile. "Help? I didn't come here to help, Marcus. I came to clean up the mess. It's your mess now, not mine." Marcus Hill, special agent with the FBI. Daniels had thought he understood who the man was, but now the complexity of it was becoming clearer. He wasn't just a man with a badge. Hill had his own life, his own allegiances, and now it seemed his own enemies. But who was this new guy, and what was his role in all of this? Daniels glanced at the officers next to him, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They didn't understand what was going on, just like he didn't. The scene that had started with a simple traffic stop had quickly spiraled into something deeper, something darker, something he wasn't ready for. "You're not going to solve this by standing here, Marcus," the man said, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "You're in deeper than you realize. And the people who are pulling the strings behind this, they won't stop until they have you cornered." The words sent a shiver down Daniels' spine. He wanted to demand answers, wanted to shout and ask who the hell this guy was, what strings he was talking about. But something about the way the man said it made him hold back, made him feel small, insignificant. Like there were things going on in the world that he couldn't even begin to understand. "What do you mean by that?" Hill's voice had changed, too. There was a crack of uncertainty in it now. Daniels noticed it immediately. Whatever this guy was saying, it was hitting Hill harder than he cared to show. The man didn't answer right away. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Hill's face. "You've been playing in their game for too long, Marcus, but you've always been one step behind. They've been watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. And now," Hill's jaw clenched, "enough." The word was soft, but it carried a weight behind it that silenced the newcomer immediately. Daniel's mind was racing. What was going on? Who were these people? Who was the man in the shadows? And why was Hill suddenly acting like he was the one in the hot seat? This wasn't the calm, collected FBI agent he had imagined. This was someone on edge, someone who was playing a dangerous game, and it was all spiraling out of control. The man in the shadows, sensing the shift in the air, straightened. "I'll let you handle the cleanup, Marcus," he said. But don't think for a second that you're out of this. The moment you step outside the lines, you'll realize how deep you've really gotten. With that, he turned and walked back toward the darkness, fading into it like a shadow in the night. The tension left in his wake hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one spoke. Daniels could feel his pulse in his ears, the world moving in slow motion around him. Was this some kind of threat? Or was it a warning? And what did it have to do with Hill? Who were the people pulling strings? And how did they connect to this quiet, suburban street where this whole mess had started? The silence was shattered by a distant sound, an engine, revving in the distance, getting closer by the second. The officers turned their heads instinctively, their senses heightened. The hair on the back of Daniel's neck stood up, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Get in your car, Daniels," Hill said, his voice almost a command. "We're not done here." Daniels stared at him for a moment, unsure what to do. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. Was he just a cop doing his job, or was he entangled in something much bigger than he could comprehend? But when Hill's eyes met his, there was no denying it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniels stepped toward his car, his hand hovering over the door handle, but the words still lingered in the air. "The people behind this, who are they, Marcus?" Hill didn't answer immediately. He just stared at him, his face tight, unreadable. "You don't want to know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're going to." And then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Daniels standing in the growing darkness, unsure of what came next. The sound of tires screeching on wet pavement echoed through the air, signaling the beginning of something much bigger than any of them had expected. But Daniels had no idea yet. This was only the beginning. Daniels sat in his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the night. He couldn't shake the weight of the man's words, the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Every time Daniels tried to focus, all he could see was Hill's face, tense and guarded, like he was holding on to something dangerous, something that would shatter everything if it came to light. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his radio crackling to life. A voice on the other end, sharp and urgent, broke through the static. "Officer Daniels, you need to head to Central Ave. We've got a situation." Daniels blinked, his heart rate picking up again. A situation? Was it a coincidence? Was this the moment everything was going to come crashing down? Or was it just another distraction to keep him in the dark? His hands moved automatically, the engine roaring to life as he shifted the car into gear. He was supposed to be part of a team, part of something bigger. But right now, he felt completely alone. There was no one to trust. Not his fellow officers, not Hill. Hell, he wasn't sure if he could even trust himself. He sped down the street, the flashing lights of his cruiser casting eerie shadows on the empty road. Every corner he turned, every alley he passed, felt like he was being watched. The silence was heavy, like the calm before a storm. And he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming, it was going to hit harder than anything he had faced before. When he reached Central Ave, the scene in front of him was chaotic. Several police cars were already parked on the side of the street, their sirens flickering in the distance, casting a red glow against the night. The usual crowd of curious onlookers stood a few feet away, their faces filled with uncertainty. It didn't take long for Daniels to realize this wasn't just another routine call. It was something bigger. He stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the area. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as his gaze fell on a man standing near the edge of the crowd, something clicked. It was him, the man from earlier, the one who had stepped out of the shadows and spoken to Hill. Daniel's pulse quickened. He couldn't explain why, but the sight of him made every instinct in his body scream danger. The man's eyes met his, a brief flicker of recognition passing between them. And then, just as quickly, the man turned away, disappearing into the crowd like a ghost. Daniels hesitated for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. Was this a trap? Were they leading him somewhere, pulling him into something he couldn't control? He wasn't sure, but he had to follow. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything. He made his way toward the group of officers, but before he could ask what was going on, a voice cut through the noise. It was Hill's. "Daniels!" Hill's voice was low, urgent, but there was something else in it, something unspoken, something dangerous. You shouldn't be here. You need to leave. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, staring at Hill, trying to read his face. What the hell was going on? Hill wasn't just an FBI agent. He was a part of something larger, something Daniels wasn't privy to. He had always thought of Hill as the kind of man who had all the answers, who was always 5 steps ahead. But now, standing here, Daniels realized Hill was just as trapped as the rest of them. "What do you mean, I need to leave?" Daniels shot back, his voice rising. "What's happening, Marcus? Why are we here? What's going on with all of this?" Hill's eyes darted around, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any second. "This is bigger than you know. Trust me, you don't want to get caught up in it." His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes narrowing in warning. "The people behind this, they've been watching you. Watching us." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. He had never seen Hill like this before. The confident, calm agent was gone, replaced by a man who was genuinely scared. It was enough to make his stomach turn. "Who are they?" Daniels demanded, his voice hoarse with frustration. "What do you know, Hill?" Before Hill could respond, a distant sound cut through the air, the unmistakable screech of tires, followed by the sharp crack of gunshots. Daniels spun around, his instincts kicking in as his hand reached for his weapon. The crowd scattered in an instant, panic setting in as people ducked for cover. Hill grabbed Daniels' arm, pulling him back. "Get down," he ordered, his voice urgent. "They're here." Daniels could barely process the words before another set of gunshots rang out, this time closer. It was chaos. His heart raced as the sound of bullets filled the air, the world blurring around him. He ducked behind a nearby car, his breathing rapid, adrenaline flooding his system. "What the hell is going on?" Daniels shouted, his mind scrambling to make sense of the madness. "Who's shooting at us?" Hill didn't answer. He was focused, his eyes scanning the street as if he already knew where the threat was coming from. "Stay down," he barked again. "We need to move now." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as they made their way to cover behind a dumpster, the noise of the gunfire echoing through the night. It felt like the world was collapsing around them. His mind couldn't catch up. Who had set this up? Who was behind all of this? And why was it happening now? He tried to calm himself, but the questions kept coming. Who were they? What did Hill know that he wasn't telling him? And most importantly, why had they gone after him? Suddenly, a voice crackled over the radio in his ear. "Officer Daniels, we've got reports of a second team moving in. You need to get out of there now. They're closing in." Daniels froze, a wave of dread washing over him. Closing in? The enemy was here, and he had no idea who they were or how many there were. "You're not going to make it out of this if you don't follow me," Hill said, his voice sharp. "Trust me." And in that moment, as Daniels looked into Hill's eyes, he realized the depth of it all. The layers of deception, the hidden dangers, the shadows that had been lurking just beneath the surface. They were in deeper than either of them could have imagined. And as the gunfire intensified, Daniels had no choice but to follow. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: he wasn't getting out of this alone. As Daniels and Hill crouched behind the dumpster, the distant sounds of gunfire continued to ring in their ears, muffled by the chaos of the moment. But something was different. The steady rhythm of the shots, the distant echoes, it didn't sound like a typical standoff. No, it felt more coordinated, calculated, like someone was pulling the strings from the shadows, manipulating the chaos. Daniels could feel the tension tightening around him, each breath more labored than the last. "What's happening, Marcus?" Daniels hissed, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Who the hell is doing this?" Hill didn't answer right away. His eyes darted around, scanning the area with a calmness that didn't match the situation. He wasn't rattled, not like Daniels was. It was as if he had seen this before, like he knew exactly what was going to happen next. "Just stay close," Hill muttered. "We need to get to the alley now." Daniels hesitated for a second, but with the sound of more shots firing in the distance, he didn't need more convincing. They sprinted to the alley, moving swiftly but quietly, the heavy weight of uncertainty hanging over them. Just as they reached the alleyway, Hill stopped. His eyes went wide, the color draining from his face. Daniels, heart pounding, glanced over at him. "What's wrong?" he asked, already dreading the answer. Hill's voice was barely a whisper, but it hit Daniels like a freight train. This wasn't supposed to happen. Before Daniels could respond, the air around them seemed to crackle. A low hum, an almost imperceptible vibration in the ground, shook the air. It wasn't a sound he could place, more like a low-frequency warning, something that told him that the ground beneath them was shifting. Something big was coming. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from the far end of the alley. A shadow loomed at the entrance, blocking out the light. It was a figure, tall, silhouetted in the dim light, but there was something different about it. The way it moved was too smooth, too confident. It wasn't human, at least not in the way Daniels understood. "Who is that?" Daniels whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. Hill's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and horror. "That's him." The figure stepped into view, and Daniel's blood ran cold. It wasn't the man from earlier, the one who had spoken to Hill, but someone far more menacing. A man in a black suit, with eyes that burned with an intensity Daniels couldn't describe. He was calm, unnervingly calm, but there was an aura of power that radiated off him, as if he had the world in his grip. "Do you know who I am, Agent Hill?" The man's voice was smooth, almost friendly, but there was a cruelty lurking beneath it. Hill didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon but pausing, unsure. It was as if he knew something Daniels didn't, something about this man that made him hesitate. Daniels felt a cold sweat break out along his back. "Who the hell is this guy?" he demanded, though his voice shook. The man smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was calculated, deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. "Ah, the confused officer," the man mused. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't just some random act of violence. This is orchestrated. Every step, every move, you're just pawns in a much bigger game." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He looked at Hill, but the FBI agent's face was unreadable. He didn't say anything, didn't warn him. The silence between them grew heavy, the weight of the man's words sinking in. "What's he talking about, Marcus?" Daniels asked, his voice rising in frustration. "Why won't you tell me what's really going on?" But Hill remained silent, eyes locked on the man in the black suit. The silence between them stretched, building into a palpable tension, thick enough to suffocate anyone who was caught in it. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, Daniels saw something almost human behind his eyes. Anger. Real anger. "You think this is a game?" The man snarled. "You think you have any control over this situation?" Before Daniels could respond, the man snapped his fingers, and in that instant, several more figures emerged from the shadows. Silent, menacing, like ghosts moving in perfect unison. Daniels took a step back, instinctively reaching for his radio, but the signal was dead. No communication. No backup. He was trapped, surrounded, and the realization hit him hard. He was never supposed to make it out of this alive. "Look at you," the man continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're caught in a web you don't even know exists. You've been a part of something much bigger than you realize. All of you have. And now you're in over your heads." Hill didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward Daniels. It was the briefest of glances, but it was enough. In that split second, Daniels saw the truth. Hill wasn't in control here. He was just as trapped as the rest of them. But it wasn't just Hill. This was bigger. Much bigger. The man in the black suit stepped closer, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're playing their game now," he said, his voice like ice. "And you're going to lose." Daniel's pulse raced. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. But every answer he reached for only led to more questions. He had no idea who this man was, why he was doing this, or what Hill had gotten involved in. But one thing was clear: nothing was as it seemed. And they were all about to be swept into something much darker than they could ever imagine. The man's voice cut through the air again, sharp as a knife. "Prepare yourself, Officer Daniels. The game has only just begun." And with that, the darkness seemed to close in, the world around them shifting, changing, becoming something unrecognizable. The man in the black suit took another step forward. His eyes locked on Daniels with an intensity that made his stomach churn. It was as if this whole situation had been leading to this moment, a confrontation he never saw coming, but somehow had always been inevitable. He could hear Hill's breath beside him, quick, sharp, but the FBI agent wasn't moving. It was like he was paralyzed by something deeper than fear, something he couldn't escape, something that had taken root a long time ago. Who are you? Daniel's voice was hoarse, his words thick with a mix of anger and confusion. What is this? What the hell do you want with us? The man in the black suit's lips curled into a slight smile, but it was cold. Oh, you still don't get it, do you? He said, his voice smooth as silk but heavy with menace. You've been playing your part in this game for a long time, Daniels. The badge, the uniform, it's all just a costume. You're not a hero. You never were. Daniels felt the world tilt for a moment. What did he mean? Hill's silence was louder than any words he could say. He could see the weight of the truth in Hill's eyes now, a truth that had been hidden for too long. Hill wasn't just an FBI agent anymore. He was something else, something that had been woven into the fabric of this twisted game. You're FBI, Daniels muttered, almost to himself, the pieces finally starting to fit together. But then his eyes flicked to the man in the suit. But you're not. Who are you? The man chuckled darkly. I am the one pulling the strings, the one who's been keeping an eye on all of you. You think you're fighting for justice? You think you're doing the right thing? It's all a lie, Daniels. Everything you've ever believed in. A shiver ran down Daniels' spine. A lie? Don't listen to him, Hill finally spoke. His voice strained, but his tone was urgent. This isn't what you think it is. He's trying to manipulate you, all of us. But it was too late. Daniels could see the truth in Hill's eyes now, and that truth was darker than anything he could have ever imagined. Hill wasn't just part of the FBI. He was complicit in something far bigger than either of them. The man in the black suit wasn't just a random player. He was the puppet master, and everyone, including Hill, was tangled in his strings. I'm not the one you need to be afraid of, the man in the suit said, his voice low and menacing, as if savoring the moment. The real threat is much closer than you think. The game isn't over yet. It's only just begun. Daniels felt his heart skip a beat as everything seemed to snap into place. The violence, the chaos, Hill's strange behavior, it was all connected. He had been right all along. There was something more going on, something hidden just beneath the surface. Something that wasn't just about bad cops or bad guys. No, it was much bigger. You're all part of it, the man continued, his gaze fixed on Hill now. You've been dancing to my tune for years. You just didn't know it. Daniel's mind raced, the realization dawning on him with a sickening clarity. Hill had been playing both sides, working with the FBI, but feeding into a far more dangerous web. And Daniels? He'd been a pawn all along, a piece in a game he never signed up for. But now, it was clear. There was no escape. Hill stepped forward, his hand raised in a futile attempt to intervene. You don't have to do this, Daniels. But the man in the black suit cut him off with a wave of his hand, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the distance. More figures emerged from the shadows, silent, methodical, each one moving like a ghost. Daniel's heart pounded, the weight of the moment crushing him. He wasn't sure if he could trust Hill anymore. Could he even trust himself? You're out of options, Officer Daniels, the man in the suit said, his voice laced with cold satisfaction. You can't walk away from this. For a second, Daniels felt the urge to run, to break free of it all. But as he took a step back, he saw something in Hill's eyes. A flicker of regret? A silent plea? Whatever it was, Daniels knew that there was no way out. The walls were closing in on him. The man smiled again, a wicked, knowing grin. You see, this is the end of the line for both of you. For all of you. And just as Daniels felt his last shred of hope slip away, something unexpected happened. Hill's expression changed in the blink of an eye, fury replacing the regret. He moved quickly, his hand darting to his jacket pocket. Before Daniels could react, Hill pulled out a small black device, pressing it into his hand. What is this? Daniels asked, his voice shaking as he looked at the strange gadget. Hill's eyes were wild now, almost pleading. It's your way out. You have to trust me, Daniels. I'm sorry. I never wanted any of this. But this is the only way. Daniels felt a lump form in his throat as the realization hit him. Hill had been working against them all along. The device wasn't meant to protect him. It was meant to stop the game from escalating, to disable the forces that were pushing him into a corner. But it was also a trap, a double cross. Before Daniels could make a decision, the man in the black suit laughed, the sound echoing through the alley. "You think you can outsmart me?" he taunted. "You really don't understand, do you?" And then, with a flick of his wrist, he activated something that made the entire alley go dark. For a moment, Daniels couldn't see a thing. The world was black, silent, and then a flash of light. When his vision cleared, everything had changed. Hill was on the ground, his body limp, and the man in the black suit was gone. The only thing left in the alley was Daniels, standing in the middle of a collapsing game he never asked to be a part of. The truth was out now, dangerously so, and there was no going back. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest, and for the first time, he truly understood what Hill meant when he said there was no way out. This was no longer about just survival. This was about something far bigger, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As Daniels stepped forward, a new chapter of the game began, and he had no idea if he was playing it or if it was playing him. Daniels stood in the darkness, his breath shallow, his mind racing to piece together what had just happened. The alley was still silent, the only sound the distant hum of traffic, as if the world had paused around him. The device Hill had handed him was still clutched in his hand, its weight oddly comforting in the middle of the chaos. Hill's body lay lifeless on the ground, his chest barely rising, a grim reminder of how far things had gone. The realization hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. Hill had truly been trapped, just like him. He hadn't been the mastermind, not in the way the man in the black suit had been. Hill had been forced into this, caught up in a game that had played him just as much as it had played Daniels. The betrayal stung, but there was no time to mourn it. There was no time for anything but survival now. But what did survival mean anymore? He looked down at Hill's body, his hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. The world had become so much darker in just a few hours, and Daniels had no idea where it was going. One thing was certain, he couldn't keep running from it. He had to confront this head-on. Without another thought, he pocketed the device and stepped over Hill's body. It felt wrong to leave him there, but Daniels had no choice. There was a bigger picture unfolding, one that he was now squarely in the middle of. He could only hope that Hill had been right about the device, that it was a chance to stop this madness, to stop the man in the black suit. As he walked through the alley, his thoughts swirled. The man had been right about one thing. Daniels had never understood the game he was part of. He had always thought his work was about doing right, following the law. But now he saw how easily that system could be manipulated, how easily it could be used to push people into places they never should have been. How everyone, including himself, was just a piece on a larger chessboard. The darkness ahead didn't seem so oppressive anymore. As he made his way to the street, the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances were a welcome sight. They weren't just signals of authority, they were his ticket out. The sirens cut through the quiet like a lifeline, offering him a shred of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. Daniels didn't know who he could trust anymore, but the first step was clear. He had to make sure the device didn't fall into the wrong hands. He couldn't let whatever Hill had tried to do go to waste. It was his responsibility now. It was the only thing he had left. He approached the first police officer he saw, his voice shaky but resolute. "I need to talk to whoever's in charge. Now." The officer looked at him, his expression unreadable, but he didn't hesitate. Daniels was too familiar with the look in his eyes, the questioning, the suspicion. Still, the officer nodded and moved toward a nearby squad car. As Daniels followed, his mind was a whirlwind. He didn't know how this would play out. He didn't know if he could make anyone believe the truth. But one thing was certain, the game had changed, and he had to be the one to rewrite the rules. Hours passed before Daniels found himself sitting in a small, cold interrogation room. The only light came from a single bulb overhead, casting long shadows across the table in front of him. His hands were still shaking, his mind racing. But this time, he wasn't alone. Across from him sat an older detective, grizzled, worn down by years of the same fights, but with an intensity in his eyes that matched Daniels. "Tell me what happened," the detective said, his voice low but steady. He didn't ask for details right away. He didn't press. He just waited. And that was enough for Daniels to begin. He explained it all. Everything that had happened, from the moment he had arrested the man in the alley to the deadly confrontation with the black-suited figure. He told him about Hill, about the device, about the game. The detective listened, his gaze never leaving Daniels. When the story finally ended, there was a long silence. The detective didn't say anything right away, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Sounds like a hell of a story," he said quietly. Daniels swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm not making this up," he said, his voice tight. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's all real. The people behind this, whoever they are, they're not going to stop. They'll keep using us like pawns until we've all been played. We have to stop them." The detective regarded him for a moment, and then, to Daniel's surprise, he nodded. "I believe you, but you need to understand something." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There's more going on here than you know. Hill wasn't just a pawn, he was one of the people you've been running from." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The detective leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Hill was part of something much bigger. His role, his connections, they go higher than you think. But you're not out of it yet. The truth you're holding, it's dangerous. And the people who want it, they won't stop until they've silenced every last one of you." The weight of the detective's words hit Daniels like a sledgehammer. He wasn't out of this. Not by a long shot. The real fight was just beginning. But for the first time in hours, Daniels felt a small spark of hope. The pieces were finally starting to come together. There was no turning back now. He had been thrust into a game far bigger than he ever imagined, but he wasn't just going to be another pawn. He was going to take control. The detective slid a file across the table, the thick paper cutting through the tension in the room. "You need to see this," he said quietly. "It's your next move." Daniels opened the file, his heart racing. Inside was a photograph of the man in the black suit. But it wasn't just a mugshot. It was a photo from years ago, before everything had started, before the game had even begun. And the man in the photo wasn't a stranger. It was someone Daniels knew. The real story was just beginning. As Daniels walked out of the room, the weight of the file in his hands, he understood one thing clearly. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. And he was going to fight for the truth, no matter what it took. The pieces were falling into place, one by one. And Daniels knew that this fight, this battle, would be one that would echo through every corner of his life from here on out. The world may have tried to break him, but he wasn't going to let it. Not without a fight. And in the end, he would be the one who wrote the final move.